Welcome everyone to our program today. My name is Michelle Massey and I am the Director of Public Programs and Marketing at the Museum of Russian Art in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a pleasure to bring you into the fold on this virtual program today to discuss an exciting new book, Diaghilev's Empire, with our author, Rupert Christiansen. We are thrilled to have you be a part of this event where you can actually submit your questions in the chat box here on this forum. Those questions will only be visible to the panelists and the authors, so feel free. We will try to get to those right at the end of our program. We're going to be going just about an hour today, so just know that this program will also be recorded as well. And this will be reachable and viewable and shareable via our YouTube channel and our website, TMORA.org. I also want to make sure that you know that this wonderful book is available via our amazing shop, TMORA shop, as well as the book of our other author that is on this program. And we'll go into that as we talk about the program, but we'll be sharing those links to make sure that you have access to these books as well. This is going to be a wonderful program. I'd like to take this opportunity to bring on my colleague, the curator of the Museum of Russian Art, in order to help moderate this and just be a part of the conversation should it come up. So my colleague, many of you may already know, the amazing, renowned curator of our museum, has been with us for the last 15 years, has curated over 100 exhibitions, and is an area expert in many areas. You may have seen some of our other virtual programs that we've done. So with that, please welcome to the program, Dr. Masha Zavialova.
Greetings, everyone. And today it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers and participants of the discussion, Rupert Christiansen and Simon Morrison. Both are scholars and renowned writers on music and ballet, and their books on the history of Russian ballet have become landmarks in the history of this genre. Rupert Christiansen is from London, and he will be speaking from London. He was educated at King's College at Cambridge and comes from actually a renowned family of British publishers and editors of several generations. And he wrote a number of books on various genres. And today we will be looking into his book on Diaghilev, and that will be introduced and discussed also with Simon Morrison. Simon Morrison is our compatriot from the US. He got his education from the University of Toronto, McGill University, and a PhD from Princeton, where he currently teaches. And his book, Bolshoi Confidential, Secrets of the Russian Ballet from the Tsars to the Present, 2016, also became quite an important contribution to the history of the Russian ballet. We actually, in our museum in 2021, had an exhibition on the Ballets Russes, photography by Otto Happy. The Otto Happy is a renowned British photographer, and he photographed participants of the Diaghilev's Ballets Russes in London between mostly in the 1910s. So those people who are here with us, who are our members and visitors, I'm sure still remember that wonderful show. And with this, let me give the floor to our speakers and participants today. Rupert and Simon, you're welcome.
Thank you, Masha.
Thank you very much. I think I'll lead off, Rupert, if I may, with some compliments. I grew up reading a lot of. Will you stop? I grew up. My first dose of ballet history was the Ballets Russes, and I grew up reading Lynn Garofola's book and the books by Dickie Buckle and various other figures, as well as the long and strange non-hagiography of Václav Nijinsky, Leap into Madness and the various films made about him. And so I think my general impression of the history of the entire art form was somewhat distorted by these kind of musical as well as choreographic masterpieces of the early 20th century. And teaching this material primarily from the music side of things, but also in terms of visual arts and dance and how they don't get along or get along and in the repertoire of the 20th century and earlier. I was struck reading your book, which I was frankly asked to blurb and didn't know anything about until it landed, with just how incredibly fresh and vibrant it is at the sentence level. I have to say it's the greatest read I've encountered in ballet history. And the first question is not very kind because I'm not a kind person, but it was just an absolute page turner. And I sat with it this summer and just read it straight, the start to finish through a day. And it was marvelous, both as a kind of wonderful kind of guide and a very cheerful one through the history of this company, which obviously had its ups and downs. But then I was just struck by how wonderful the writing was describing the postlude, the afterlife of the company in the United States, particularly with all of these knockoffs. And so I guess the first thing I was going to ask you about is, again, at the sentence paragraph level, it's just everything it just glitters. And I was just wondering how you put it together. Was it a project of a lot of rewrites or a lot of thought? Is it kind of your reaction to the nature of the existing literature? Is it a kind of summation of a lot of previous writings about it? So I was just interested a little bit. I know it's not good to ask an author about process, but I'm going to try and do so here.
It's a book with quite an interesting origin, because actually it wasn't a book I wanted to write. The one I wanted to write was going to be called After the Ballets Russes, and it was going to be quite a scholarly and detailed book about everything that happened after Diaghilev died. I didn't think I had anything new or fresh to say about the Diaghilev era, which ended with his death in 1929. I was more interested in the aftermath, in his legacy, which I think it doesn't get properly covered in the standard ballet histories. But my publisher, bless them, Faber, lead publisher in the UK, said, no, that's not a commercial prospect. I want you to do the whole damn thing from start to finish. So, okay, fine. So I spent about a year, working up the basics and getting down to a little bit of research. And then, of course, COVID struck, and all the libraries and archives closed, and really any possibility of doing any original research faded. But it did give me the time and just to write the damn thing, and I wrote it quickly. And I think if it is fresh, and I'm very touched and flattered that you think it has that freshness, it's because I wrote it very fast and out of just love, really, and fascination. I'm a ballettomane. I was actually an opera critic for the Daily Telegraph in London for 25 years. But I always say that, I was married to opera, but ballet was my bit on the side, my girlfriend, with something I'm really infatuated with.
When you said that, when you began it, you didn't think you had anything new to say. What was it? To me, it strikes me that there's a lot of right from the start, there's a lot of discussion of, the foundation of other ballet companies in the UK primarily, and a lot of discussion of gender and sexuality, and reaction in favor of and against that in the legacy of the Diaghilev, specifically in the representations of Nijinsky's life and tragic death. And I'm just wondering, is that something you actually thought was just not properly discussed in the literature, and something that was actually missing in general from considerations of the history of the art?
I think Lynn Garifola has done the really great work on the Diaghilev era, and really her book Diaghilev's Ballets Russes is the sort of the Mount Everest, and I don't think I've said anything particularly. I don't think I've said anything that's not in her book. I'm not being unduly modest here. It's just she's the one who's done the groundwork in a way that I didn't.
Well, we could disagree about about that, because I actually what struck me was the focus on the gender and sexual politics of the Ballets Russes and how it relates to, ballet before. I mean, there's often, within the history of this art form, there's no shortage of tales of young women, girls, the loge infernale, the way there's a sort of sexual exploitation that takes place there. Then we have, in the case of the Diaghilev company, a very strong and fascinating homoerotic element that gets developed. Then we also have Nijinsky's sister, Bronislava Nijinskaya, who seems to have been, if not sort of bisexual or polysexual, with a strong sort of feminist argument to make in her works. And I thought that the way in which you actually looked at this company and actually thought about reactions against it in cultural discourse, discussion about ballet in the United States, the UK, and elsewhere, that was to me really fascinating. The fact that you have this company that was incredibly provocative, and I don't know if you agree with this, was very good at self-promotion. And then you have this sort of reaction to, its legacy in different ways in the conservative, confines of this country and elsewhere. And that to me struck me as a real contribution. Is like this, because I don't know, it seems to me that from where I come from, the Ballets Russes is modernism in the arts, and it's 20 years and then it disappears. But actually thinking about its legacy, which, as you said, was the starting point of your project, actually really explains a lot about how ballet developed in this country, and modern dance developed in this country, and how the Royal developed and so forth. And so that to me was really special about this book, and actually was a real through line, is looking at this as it's a great book of gender and sexuality studies, I think.
Oh, thank you.
So
I do think it is fascinating the way that ballet was an exclusively, as you might say, a heterosexual art form in the 19th century, and has been very, very decisively queered, to use the fashionable word, through the 20th century. I would like to know, maybe you would know this, or maybe Masha knows this. I get the sense, though, that in Russia there's much less of this stigma of homosexuality around ballet than there is in the West. I think it's very, very much a British and American prejudice that ballet dancers and ballet lovers are gay men, and you can sort of trace the origins of that through the 1920s and 1930s. I don't quite know where it comes from.
I think that the later 19th century context, in thinking about one of my guys, Tchaikovsky, who was 100% homosexual, who was somebody who had a brief lavender marriage, a beard that the girl in question misinterpreted, and that went to hell. But basically somebody who had, a wonderful group of friends, a brother who was also homosexual, had a rich and wonderful and even, I would say, experimental sexual life, judging from his unexpurgated letters and diaries. And the tolerance for that, it just seems to be, it was just to the point that the first edition of his correspondence with his patroness, Nadezhda von Meck, which was published in the early Stalinist era, it says right at the start, Tchaikovsky was homosexual. And then that gradually gets suppressed over the course of the 20th century. So I think that there was something more liberal, frankly, in this realm. So he was conservative politically, but conservative politically in that late 19th century Russian context did not mean that there was a kind of backlash against or an intolerance of homosexuality, given that a lot of his partners, friends, lovers were members of the court establishment. And so that I think is interesting about it.
It's true. I think it's certainly true that Diaghilev was extraordinarily uninhibited about it. I mean, he made no bones about it anywhere he was, and never seemed to be. He didn't seem to have any fear of being arrested or persecuted. It was very much the contemporary attitude: is that I'm gay, take it or leave it.
Yeah, we it's sort of, the Bolsheviks actually were more conservative on those matters, despite being revolutionaries, than the imperial establishment.
Yeah.
So if you're surrounded and you're in this world of the symbolist era in the late 19th century, part of it was experiment in terms of identity and the play and a sort of polymorphousness and polysexuality that I think actually drove a lot of the writerly and dancerly and musical experiment. Do you think, by the way, one of the things I read, I'll just ask you this question about Nijinsky and Diaghilev. Who seduced who, in your opinion? Because that's gone back and forth. Sorry.
No, I'm absolutely convinced that Diaghilev seduced Nijinsky. And it wasn't
not the other way around.
It wasn't even much of I don't think it was even much of a seduction. I think young men, were expected to perform certain services to older men. That goes back to the ancient Greeks. And Diaghilev, wasn't sexually very predatory. He seemed to just like a bit of cuddling and other stuff. He wasn't into anything very, very kinky or demanding. And both Nijinsky and Massine, were happy to service him because, it was in their professional interests. But I don't think there's any indication that Nijinsky had any other homosexual, was of a homosexual persuasion. I'm convinced that he was heterosexual.
Not bi. That's interesting.
I mean, I don't know, these categories.
I know. It's all
very tiresome, aren't they, really? But no, I don't actually. I really don't.
Do you, the other thing I wanted to focus on here, and going back to this issue about the Ballets Russes is modernism. And, everybody goes through conservatory or music school, you learn the Rite of Spring is this sort of shattering masterpiece, and Petrushka and Firebird, those big three of Stravinsky early on. And yet later on, if as one grows old in this profession, you find out there was another company, the Ballet Suédois, that existed and kind of came and went, I think in the same theater. I think they took the lease at the Champs-Élysées.
Yes.
But the question is, do you think that the Ballets Russes deserves the spotlight, all of the spotlight, and or do you think that the Ballets Suédois, had things been different, we might be talking about the Suédois as the great modernist organization versus...
Ballets Suédois is very, very fascinating, because one thing is, of course, it only lasted for about 5 years. And but the thing is, although it did mount these extraordinarily experimental works, much more daring and strange and avant-garde than anything Diaghilev did, judging from the evidence and the pictures that we have of it, its bread and butter, the way it's made its money, was with very, very traditional sort of Scandinavian folk dance performances. That's what people came to see. And it was subsidized entirely by one the one fortune of this man Rolf de Marais, and the problem was that he just ran out of money very quickly.
It
And
wasn't
his
the
relationship with Jean Bourlin, who was his Nijinsky, as it were, also went into terminal decline, and the whole thing collapsed very quickly. So I don't think it didn't have the infrastructure that the Ballets Russes had, and I don't think in a way that they promoted themselves as well. Well, the Ballets Russes' reputation sort of roller coaster, didn't it? I mean, it became a legend before the First World War, and it was sort of self-perpetuating. And the Ballet Suédois never had a chance to establish itself like that. Never had any success in London at all. It was, it toured a lot, but it was basically Paris and Berlin, you know, it was based in Paris and Berlin. And during the 1920s, when there was an awful lot going on anyway, there were all, I think there were probably other companies as well, of which we know nothing, also doing crazy stuff at that time. It was,
I know with the Suédois that the Ballet Suédois, when they came to the United States and they performed on what was called the Century Rooftop Theater, which, because of air conditioning, there was no air conditioning, so you just perform outside on the top of buildings, and just dreadful reviews. And you got a sense that the road show was really poorly organized and shambolic. Is that the case with the Ballets Russes? I mean, what was their sort of?
No, it was very well organized, even though Diaghilev had no interest in money. And, you know, really the company lived from hand to mouth, and there were times when it almost collapsed. But he did have this inner circle of people who kept the whole thing on the road. You know, that was one aspect of his genius, I think, that he had very good deputies.
Did he travel with the company, or did they ever go off on their own?
Almost always. He didn't like, the only thing is he didn't like sea travel very much. He was very, very superstitious, because a gypsy apparently had told him in his youth that he would die on water. So he got frightfully nervous whenever he was on a boat, and would put you know, what do they call those things? Not a life raft around his neck the whole time he was on a boat.
Wow, he must have been, I don't know if he was a tippler, but I mean, I imagine him sitting in the lounge of these boats for a long time and wishing for the invention of the Zeppelin or something. If Diaghilev was around, if you could go back in time, do you have a question you'd ask him? I'm sure.
That is a very interesting question. And what fascinates me about him is that actually it's very hit and miss. Like a lot of great, you know, art gallery owners, they have their great sort of publishers, actually the same way. They have their great successes, but my God, they have their failures as well. And what I'd like to find out is whether he really had very good taste, or whether it was just luck, and that he was grabbing at everything that was there, and some things worked and some things didn't.
Yeah, you get a sense. I mean,
in history as this person who had this magical ability to bring together the greatest dancers, the greatest composers, everything, blah blah blah. Which, you know, on occasion he did, but only about 30% of the time. There were some terrible flops.
Yeah, there's
better.
Like Ode is one, right? There's a few,
Yes,
few of them that.
I mean, throughout the whole 20 years of the Ballets Russes, you know, there's a big flop every year.
It's interesting. I mean, that question is some of the flops are now iconic works. I mean, at least musically, like Daphnis and Chloe, right? Seems to have been a fiasco because of the breakdown of the relationship with Fokine. And yet,
well, exactly. Two of the greatest scores the Ballet Russes, when the Rite of Spring and Daphnis and Chloe only had about 4 performances before the First World War, and were considered flop. Would have been classified at that point as flops.
So did the Rite of Spring, we can safely say that the choreography is lost, except for some images and drawings. Did it survive? Why did that work? Did it become iconic, or? It
survived as primarily as an orchestral piece. There were I think there were 4 performances in Paris, the Rite of Spring, and about 4 or 5 in London, where it didn't make much of a mark in London. The whole scandal thing was a PR stunt. I read another book about Diaghilev, just Diaghilev alone, and one of the arguments there is that the Rite of Spring scandal, whether May 29th, 1913, 7:30, I don't know what else was on the program. That's never discussed, but you would know. But was it actually people outraged by it? You say it's a manufactured scandal. Was it like, okay, the claque is going to actually protest this work? Yeah.
Or was it actually people actually were ginned up to think this would be some shocking thing, and actually they were disappointed and actually booed at that? Because I've read that argument as well.
No, I think it was a PR stunt. Diaghilev was thrilled by it, and previous first nights in Paris were always full of booing and people shouting. There's the premiere of Ibsen's play The Wild Duck is my favorite, where the audience all started quacking. And then the Jinsky in L'après-midi d'une faune, that was a great scandal, and Parade, the first night of that, was a great scandal.
What happened with Parade?
Oh, just the same thing, people shouting and saying it was all a load of rubbish, and it made front page news. That was all they were interested in. It sold tickets. So I'm very cynical about it. And I also think, there are many accounts of the first night of the Rite of Spring which actually don't make that much of it.
Yeah, there was some poor piece
saying, there was a bit of shouting and screaming, but at the end there was a lot of applause. And then, as you say, after that, Nijinsky came on and danced the Spectre de la Rose.
Oh, so the Rite of Spring was the first thing on the program?
Yeah.
There's dissonance right there. The idea of like juxtaposing those two pieces, where you have this sort of Berlioz,
extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah.
That's what I think. Was there any thought in the program? It just seems to me if going back in time, I want to say to them, like, besides the question of like, how did you deal with failure or critical failure, right? And rebound from that. You just have to be incredibly headstrong as an artist, but the programming to me never made much sense. It's like the way in which 2 or 3 things are on the same bill, and I don't know if it was
just something for, it was sort of something for everybody, I suppose. It is absolutely bizarre. And the other thing about the Rite of Spring, of course, it was in 2 acts, and the score is only half an hour long. So there was Act 1, and then there was an interval, and then Act 2.
So what, did people go out for cake and come back?
People must have gone out for drinks and have a pee. Well, I would love to have been there, is all I can say.
The thing is, I went into that. Yeah, have you been in the theater? I'm sure you have.
Yes.
Because you look at the pit, the orchestra pit, and then you think about that score, which there's an instance where there's a piece of music that, because it became famous after the choreography disappeared, it's played by student orchestras, and it's played like this beautiful kind of well-oiled machine. When I think that Stravinsky really wanted the rough edge of it, and the idea that this was discordant, and the fact that it was probably badly played and not enough players, that kind of served the aesthetic. But it's amazing to actually be in that theater and just see the kind of compact nature of that space, and the huge kind of if you believe the rhetoric, world-shattering kind of moment this was.
I don't know. They also there's also a view that the theatre was brand new and was owned by a Jewish impresario at a time when there was a lot of anti-Semitism just after the Dreyfus case and the aftermath of the Dreyfus case. And, the clap was just dead against anything happening in this Jewish guy's theatre, which was built in a very, very Germanic sort of, it was considered to be very Germanic and modernist style. So there was a certain amount of hostility just towards the venue, let alone what Nijinsky was doing on the stage.
When the company came to London with the Sleeping Beauty version adaptation, did Diaghilev sincerely think that this idea of doing a big retrospective work or an homage to, I guess, the St. Petersburg that no longer existed, or an imperial culture that no longer existed, did he actually think that was going to be a success, or did he actually realize from the start he was actually gambling with the whole budget of the company?
Well, there was a very, very successful musical at the time called Chu Chin Chow, which was full of chinoiserie and was running night after night. And I think he thought, I could do a big hit like that too. I think that was part of it. But I think the other thing was, I think at that point, 1921, he realized he was never going to go back to Russia. And I think that was a great sadness to him. He still had family there. And he had always intended to take the company back to Russia in triumph. And there were negotiations with what you called Lunachevsky and so on, but it clearly became impossible. And I think that was his fundamental motivation.
I think his brother was arrested.
He did think his brother was arrested, yes, and died in the Gulag. No, I think he did think it would be. I think he thought it would be a great hit. They were going to do 8 performances a week, just like a musical, and it was in this popular theatre, sort of as it were, Broadway, West End theatre. It wasn't in an opera house, and he went into collaboration with a West End producer who paid for it all, and it went way over the top. And it had this rather disastrous first night where just it wasn't that it was booed or anything, it was just some things went wrong technically, because it was a very, very complicated show. And the reviews were just a bit iffy, they just thought it was all a bit of a drag and rather reactionary. It's 1921, at a time when there was all this crazy avant-garde experiment. People actually wanted something a bit livelier. But I have to say, it is the one show. If I could see one show, I don't know what question I'd ask Diaghilev. I really don't, if I was in his presence. But if I could see one show, it would be that Sleeping Princess, because people who saw it said it was like nothing. I have never forgotten the splendor of it, the gorgeousness of it, and it changed my life. People say it really changed my life.
Yeah, I don't think either of us would ask to see the Three-Cornered Hat or one of the sort of smaller pieces. But yeah, you're right. It's a fascinating. It's not a successful.
Well, of the lost ones, obviously I've seen Petrushka, I've seen Les Noces, I've seen Les Biches, Apollo, the Prodigal Son. The great ballets have survived, but that's the one that didn't, in a sense, didn't survive.
You think some of them, like Les Biches, for example, which is a score I love. Do you think that work, I guess it's known as the House Party in London, is that a work that actually? There's a discussion, like Petrushka, we still have sort of we still have, because of notation, the Faun. Parade is done, because of the Joffrey Company and others. But are some I was at a conference and somebody said, when you see Petrushka, you're just looking at you can't perform it. It's just a dead thing. It's a museum piece and it doesn't work. And I don't know what they'd say about something like Bayadere, but, but is your sense like something like some of these works were so much, part of the distinctiveness of the Diaghilev company was on occasion, they would do pieces that were very contemporary and political and social, right? So Pas d'acier, about the Soviet experiments and industrialization. And then here you have this kind of lifestyle, quote unquote, modernism, according to Lynn Garofalo. Do you think that that's a work that actually still actually, works in the sense of like?
Biche doesn't really work, although when you watch it, you can see that it must have been marvelous in 1925. Yeah. But I think, well, part of the problem for me is I've always seen it in a very big theatre, and I think it's a very subtle piece. And I'm never up close and personal with it. Maybe in a small theatre it could work still. And the trouble is also dancers just don't understand the satire now. They don't understand what is being satirized and what is being implied, because now we don't have to imply everything because everything's out there. It all hangs out.
Yeah, grotesquely over.
Beach is very, very ambiguous. It's very, very ambiguous and sly, which is not a fashionable quality aesthetically, slyness anymore.
Yeah, sort of subtlety. Do you think Bronislava, who did the choreography for that, was she treated badly by the boys in the company?
I think was, but I also think she was her own worst enemy.
In what sense?
She was really bad-tempered and shouty and very, very difficult. But you can sort of see why, because she was a strong woman trying to make her voice felt in a man's world. It was very much a man's world. Diaghilev didn't, always said that he hated women, but actually he did give her, he gave her quite a lot of rope and chances, which is to his credit, I think, that he wasn't prejudiced. He saw that she was talented and gave her opportunities that she didn't get anywhere else. But she rather blew it with him. I think if she'd been of a more peaceable temperament, she would have had a much happier life and probably got much more work.
So it was sort of okay for...
She's a bit scary. She's a bit scared, she was a bit scary, Bronislava.
Is it the case that he too could be scary and shout and it seems to me there was a lot of drama.
Oh, no, I think Diaghilev, yeah. But Diaghilev was frightfully charming with it when he needed to be at any point. And he could be a bit shouty, but I think his shouty was very well managed and properly targeted, whereas she was just screaming at everybody and sort of a bit hysterical and irrational. But that sounds a bit sexist, and it's really not meant to be, because I think she had a really, really rough time of it.
Well, and look, on the plus side, she outlasted, all of them except, I suppose, Massine.
Did, and God, there are a lot of works of hers I'd love to see. I've just read, Lynn Garofalo's just written this terrific biography of her, and I hadn't realized, for instance, she did a Hamlet ballet in the late 1930s. Sounds absolutely fascinating from what evidence we have. But of course, all her ballets now, except for Les Biches and Les Noces, are lost.
Well, Les Noces was actually, and I did have a discussion with Lynn about this, that was one of the ones that in the early 60s, the Soviets performed, strangely.
Really?
Yeah, and it's a sort of brief moment where I think Moiseyev actually did that. Yeah. And that history of like,
but not in the Jinska's choreography they performed it.
That's not clear. I mean, what the documents I saw credited her, but I can't imagine they had much of a trace of it.
How would they have got the choreography unless she was there? That's fascinating.
Yeah, she did ask me about that, but it was done. Likewise, I mean, Petrushka was done in a knockoff version, in the early Soviet period.
Yes.
And what the Russians did with these, there is a slight Ballets Russes legacy in the Soviet sphere, very, very slight. And it tends to be kind of like, re-Russifying these works, so get rid of the abstraction. Let's put the samovar back on the stage, let's what I mean?
Like the Fokine ballets are still very current, aren't they? And the Mariinsky and Bolshoi, Scheherazade, and the Prince Igor and Petrushka, they're still standard fare, bread and butter.
Yeah, exactly. What obviously but speaking of new books, this is a new biography of Balanchine out there by Jennifer Homans, and which goes right back to his Georgian roots, and it's very elaborate and quite novelistic. We have from the Ballets Russes era what Apollo Le Chat he did, right? And Prodigal Son. What happened to the cat of those three? There's one I'd like to see, actually. Because of that.
Absolutely. Well, the trouble is, Balanchine wasn't very interested in posterity. He felt he made I make my dances for the moment, and he wasn't very bothered. Whether they survived, he wasn't bothered whether they survived or not. An awful lot was lost. And there was another one, very successful one called Cotillon, which he did in 1932 or 33. Great hit in the pre-war years, but he lost interest in it. And if he wasn't going to restage it, nobody knew it. He was the only one who, this was before notation. It was before
film.
Any prospect even of filming a rehearsal.
Why did Prodigal Son then survive?
Because he wanted to do that for there was a specific dancer at the New York City Ballet he thought it would work very well for. It's probably almost a new ballet, he made a new version of it. He just went back to the school, made a new version. It's probably, the version we see now is probably not very much like what existed in 1928, which he did, and the same for Apollo, which has changed dramatically. He did 5 or 6 different, as it were, editions of it. Changed his mind about an awful lot of things in Apollo.
Yeah, with Apollo, isn't it also the case that Adolf Bohm did the version in the States? And then
yes, he did the first one.
He did the first one.
Yes.
But I know from Prokofiev's diaries that the Prodigal Son, Prokofiev was outraged by it, and it seems that actually, looking at the Prodigal Son now and the costuming, I'm sorry, that's there are things in there that are really explicit, and in the Sirens dance with the it seems to be very graphic, and from what Prokofiev says, it was like even more so, so we've lost something. He almost came to blows. That Prokofiev, who was a fairly corseted guy,
he was quite prudish, wasn't he, Prokofiev?
That's the oddity of him is, he always thought of himself as younger than Stravinsky, so more modern, which he was not, but he was prudish. He didn't, the rest of them, I don't know, like with where all of these people live, but I imagine Diaghilev lived in the center of Paris, right near the Palais Garnier. But Prokofiev would be out, in the suburbs, at the Champ de Mars. He was far away, and he stayed out of that, and he had this kind of removed from it. And the fact that he was somewhat tolerated by Diaghilev and educated in ballet is interesting on the part of actually Diaghilev seeing some sort of talent there and nurturing it. But Prokofiev really had an odd relationship to being that experimental, avant-garde, cutting edge, dissident, that obviously served him well in the Soviet sphere, where he
Yeah.
could go back and be traditional in a way that the
Yes.
Diaghilev company would not allow him to be.
Yeah.
There's letters back and forth between Prokofiev and Poulenc. They were good friends.
Really? That seems
which
unlike-
is really strange because, you know,
Yeah.
Poulenc was,
quite a gay old thing. Yeah.
he was a gay old
talk,
thing, and wonderful stories
very
about.
sophisticated, and yeah.
Yeah, but that's that, and Prokofiev would stay at his place, and and they were really good friends, and Poulenc's oboe sonata is dedicated to Prokofiev, and
Yeah.
his great opera, the Dialogue of the Carmelites, is a kind of response to the Fiery Angels.
Yes.
They really
Yes,
had,
but you can really hear Prokofiev in that opera. Actually, I agree.
yeah, and
The
it's a sort of
Carmelites is
white
very
magic version
beautiful.
of that.
Yes. Yeah.
The one I guess the last big question I'd like to ask you is that company and the Sweat Bois, and you write beautifully about the fact that something like Trocadero, which seems frivolous and parodic, is actually, there's a spirit there that actually is the life still of that company. And I thought those were some of the most beautiful pages in the book. But do you agree with Jennifer Holman's argument that the art is somewhat moribund these days, that with Balanchine, that was kind of it?
I don't think moribund. I think she goes too far, but I think it's sort of peaked. And I think one of the fascinations about Diaghilev is, for me, is that feeling that was ballet's moment in the sun, where it's absolutely central to the culture, in a way that opera was in the 19th century. But opera in the early 20th century does go into a sort of trough, and ballet takes over because ballet moves faster and it's sexier and it's more flexible
and cheaper.
And then there's this moment though that when all the possibilities have been exhausted. Balanchine and Ashton were originals in a way that I don't think any contemporary choreographer can match, simply because everything's been done now. Everything's been tried, which is not to say that there aren't, fantastic new works, powerful new works.
When you say that everything's been done, sorry to interrupt you. When you say everything's been done, is that? Do you mean that when you see a new ballet now, it's dialoguing with the past and history, and there's nothing that?
I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I mean, there are only limited possibilities of what you can do with a human body, I suppose, or to human bodies, or for human bodies. And so I think it's sort of managed decline. And it's also slightly worries me that, this increasing obsession with the Nutcracker and Swan Lake, outside the great center, outside New York and London. Ballet now is just the Nutcracker or Swan Lake.
With those two, that's the thing. With those two works, I actually wish, if we're going to be stuck with those two works, I actually wish people actually did them properly. To say, with the music in the right order.
Yes, I mean, they're wonderful, wonderful masterpieces. I've got nothing against them, but the world is big. There are more possibilities than that, and people don't seem interested anymore.
How do you feel about reconstruction projects? With the Diaghilev repertoire particularly?
I think they're on a hiding to nothing, really, don't you? I feel they're so speculative. I mean, I saw the Millicent Hodgson and Kenneth Archer did this version of the Rite of Spring, which I just thought it was meaningless.
Yeah, well, I think I was talking with Joan Acacella about this, and she said that she's not impressed by these projects because there's such limited evidence, but she says the only good thing about it is you get to see the costumes and sets.
Yes, yeah, possibly, yeah.
So we have 10 minutes left. Should we open it up to questions? Masha, Michelle?
Sure. What a pleasure to have such a deep dive. This is like shop talk for ballet. I love it. What a pleasure. Hey, Masha, do you have, since we we haven't received any questions yet, but that
Oh, okay.
welcome to come on, anybody into the chat box. Masha, did you have any questions that came to you?
No, but I have my own question.
Go ahead.
We just recently had an exhibition on the Ballets Russes and the photography by Otto Happy. And, you know, exhibitions are a different genre, of course, than the ballet. So for me, it was important for this show, which was just black and white photography, to try and find some footage of any kind of films or clips made. And it's a known fact that there are none. So I found one that's a reconstruction of Nijinsky dance from photography.
Oh, yeah.
And there was one piece also of an older Karsavina where she practiced, just practicing in a studio. And so I'm still curious, do you think there is hope that somewhere hidden in private archives there is some footage of at least some of, or at least a minute of whatever? Because it always was I was just curious about the reputation of Diaghilev's ballets, you know, the impact it made. Because I watched Petrushka and the Rite of Spring in Leningrad in the 1970s in the Mali Opera House in Leningrad. And while it was interesting, you know, the splash that the Ballets Russes did was, to me, something a lot bigger than what I saw, but I loved what I saw. And so do you think, how do you feel, what do you know about the footage on whatever Diaghilev performance?
There is absolutely nothing except these tiny, tiny fragments, partly because Diaghilev was dead against filming anything. There were various American movie companies who did offer him large amounts of money to film, but he didn't like, he was in some ways very conservative. He loathed jazz, for instance, and he thought that cinema was just for the proletariat. You know, he just didn't see the possibilities. It's very, very sad. And of course, also, as I mentioned earlier, there was no notation at that time. People were trying to develop a system of ballet notation, but that didn't happen until the 60s. So these things are, unless they're passed down by these ballets, unless they're passed down from person to person, they die very, very quickly. There's nothing there except what we read in reviews. And as I said, these tiny, tiny fragments of sort of newsreel, which are almost meaningless.
He allowed, though, there's all of those poses backstage, right? He did allow some professional photographers in to do.
Yeah, he was obviously very keen on, well, because that was promoting the, you know, the promotional photographs. Yeah. And you get the sense that the dancers spent a lot of time being photographed. Yeah, because there are thousands of images of them.
We've got a couple more questions that have come in. So I'll start with, Lara says, I took a class on first nights in college and the reaction to the Rite of Spring was presented as genuine. Was that rubbish? What kinds of evidence is there that it was manufactured for publicity?
The trouble is that there are said to be over 100 accounts of what happened on the first night of the Rite of Spring, and none of them agree. There is almost no universal agreement on the level of hostility or appreciation or what happened. And some things are clearly nonsense, like the idea that the police broke in and had to break it up. That's clearly not the case. And a lot of these accounts were written posthumously, much later. You know, I was there, and this is how I saw it. And people just made it up. I think the whole thing is a bit of a red herring. You know, this first night of the Rite of Spring, it's become this legendary occasion, and I don't think it really merits it somehow. I don't think it was that significant. First night, people boo and cheer. So what? There was a bit of fracas.
So I have another question about what is next. This one says, Mr. Christiansen, will your next book be after Diaghilev?
Well, the last third of Diaghilev's empire is about the Diaghilev legacy. It's about the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo and various rather sad men who thought they could replicate what Diaghilev had done. Including a British ballet critic who fancied himself as the new Diaghilev, who came to a rather sorry end. But
this is
no,
yeah.
But no, I'm not going to write another. This is my one ballet book. I've finished with ballet now.
We're coming toward the end of our hour. Masha, did you have any more comments or questions that you would like to add for this end part before we get to our final comments from Rupert?
Yeah, I just have a comment/question about Diaghilev himself. I grew up in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. And for me, Diaghilev, so the Ballets Russes memory was suppressed in Soviet times because, you know, they were immigrants. So that was the culture, that was an immigrant culture. And I didn't know or read much about it in the Soviet times. But Diaghilev, for me, was first and foremost one of the founders of the World of Arts magazine. And it was for me part of the art scene, not the ballet.
Really, that's fascinating.
It's only, you know, after the fact, well, when in the 70s I went to see Stravinsky's Petrushka and the Rite of Spring. I went to see and listen to Stravinsky, not Diaghilev, because that was, I'm not sure he was even mentioned in the program that was printed for those who attended. And the world of art for me was always very much part of the St. Petersburg culture versus the Moscow culture, versus the previous art styles of the itinerants. You know, that's the realist style that later migrated into the socialist realist style. So the world of art was, in a way, retrospectively anti-Soviet, opposing the art styles and the genres that were so omnipresent in the late Soviet Union.
But I think the ballets of Balanchine and so on have now become part of being reincorporated with Glasnost era, were reincorporated into the repertory, weren't they now? And I think they are accepted now.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Made their way back, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We now have this curious and horrible phenomenon of the fact that Alexei Ratmansky's repertoire, which is on the books of the Bolshoi and Mariinsky Theater, they've scrubbed his name from it.
Taking his name off.
Right. So he's now, you know, a disappeared artist, and his works are orphaned. That's what the Ministry of Culture has said. And we have this person's, even his tenure for 5 years as artistic director of the Bolshoi Theater, 2004-2009, is
been erased. Yeah.
So that is an old.
Where we were, you know, we're back where we were in the Stalinist era.
Yeah, it's the old playbook, and not only that, actually, there's a long history of it. I mean, the fact that this company that you're writing about, the Ballets Russes, you know, that part of the marketing scheme, that it was somehow Russia, right? And this art form was, you know, brought to Russia by, well, French artists, Saint-Léon and Petipa and Perrault, and before that, other people. You know, it's an appropriated art form. It was imported, and the fact that the Romanovs rulers had, you know, gargantuan amounts of money to lavish on it, you know, they imperialized it. But it was an act of huge, massive French and Italian cultural appropriation. And then it becomes, Russia actually uses this as to define its greatness on the cultural front, and a country that's never been particularly well held together. And so it had these cultural products, and here you find out really the crown jewel of the performing arts, the ballet. When you actually think about that heritage, it's, you know, it's a bit of a mirage. You know, it's foreign artists primarily, and then obviously local dancers and their greatness. But a huge swath of the history is a mirage, in the sense that these great ballets, right back to Pharaoh's Daughter, you know, have antecedents in museums in Europe, and it's an amazing kind of act of propaganda on the part of the imperial establishment and the Soviet establishment.
Simon, I think we need another edition of your wonderful Bolshoi Confidential with another couple of chapters.
There's a Russian edition coming out.
To know what's going on.
Oh, wonderful.
Now.
No, the Russian edition is coming out. That's a doozy. You should see that. All documents, no scandal.
Well, it has been such an honor to have both of you on this program. What a fascinating conversation. And it's just, what an honor it's been for, I'm sure, all of our guests to be able to listen in and to understand more about the extensive research that you both have done, and the books and the works that you bring to the table. I put in the links, the chat box, the two links to those, each of the books, Bolshoi Confidential and Diaghilev's Empire. Any final comments from you, Rupert?
No, well, just thank you very much for having me. This has been a real pleasure, and it's lovely to meet Simon, albeit virtually.
Yeah, likewise. It's a privilege. Thank you so much, and thank you for such a wonderful book that I've handed out sections of it, pages, to my students as an example of how to write.
We encourage you to get these books, everyone. So thank you. This video is going to be on our YouTube channel and on our website as well. So feel free to share with family and friends. And once again, thank you to Simon, thank you to Rupert, and to Masha for being on our program today. Everyone be well, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye-bye. Namaste.